Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another Minecraft update breakdown video. The 1.17 update has been out for a little over a month at this point, and we've all had some time to kind of experiment around with a lot of the different features that were added. And with 1.17.1 having recently released that made a couple of quality of life adjustments and changes, and with 1.18 further on the horizon, I figured that it would be a good time to talk a little bit about the different blocks that have been added and whether or not it's worth your time trying to farm out those blocks, and if so, how you should go about it. So let's go ahead and just kind of go through things alphabetically as they appear, shall we? So the first thing to discuss, of course, is the geodes, and more specifically the amethyst contained within. Now, farming the actual block of amethyst is actually fairly easy to do, especially because not only can you harvest that block from the inside of the geode itself, you can also form it from the different geode crystals, the amethyst crystals as they grow up and mature. You can harvest them and then make your own blocks of amethyst, and I think that that is relatively worth farming. You cannot farm the bud crystals in a survival conventional mode. You do not have a way of picking that up. Even Silk Touch does not work on it, so that is not something that you should really focus on trying to harvest. The crystals themselves, they are worth harvesting, but they are not worth harvesting automatically. Because they take forever to grow, and if they are broken by a piston, you're only going to get 2 shards instead of the 4 that happens when you break it by using a pickaxe. And you really shouldn't even be harvesting them with just a pickaxe, because if you use fortune on them, you can increase the amount of shards that you get from each individual crystal. So in terms of setting up something to do this automatically, don't waste your time. You're going to be in a lot better condition if you focus on getting a fortune pick and then allow these shards to grow up completely. Now, as you're aware, with the budding blocks here, you're going to be able to farm them more efficiently if you clear out the blocks around the sides and allow the crystals to grow off of each side. And then if you can find a place to AFK nearby, ideally if you can find a geode that's close to a spawner or other mob farm, that's going to be the most efficient use of your time by allowing the amethyst to grow up and then harvest it with your fortune picks. The next thing on our agenda, we have the azaleas, and the azaleas fall into the same kind of category as moss. We'll talk about moss a little bit later, but in order to get these, of course, you will need to bone meal a moss block, and it will then generate with many things on top of it, one of those things being these little azalea bushes, and they can come in the flowering variant and not. I think that these are relatively worth farming, despite the fact that you only get oak wood out of the azaleas. I'm personally in the camp of loving or hoping to see a new type of wood added with the azaleas in 1.18, but we'll see if that's something that actually comes to fruition. But even just these azalea bushes, they're a nice kind of decoration as well. And when fully grown, harvesting the azalea leaves, they're a fairly nice decorative block as well. So I think that these are certainly worth your time, and if you set up an AFK moss block farm, then you're likely going to be able to get a fair amount of both these bushes and the leaves that come off of the fully grown trees as well. So next up, we have the block of copper, and of course the copper ingots, things that you can make with copper. Of course, this is the hot new building block on the market, so yes, this is absolutely something that is worth harvesting and farming. Of course, the best way to do that is either by using fortune on the copper that you find naturally generating throughout the world, or setting up a drowned farm and collecting drown with a looting weapon, because not only was that a fairly efficient means to do in 1.17, but in 1.17.1, the drop rate for these copper ingots was increased, so you can now more effectively get them from drowned. And there have been many YouTubers, Tango Tech and others, that have made very phenomenal videos of breaking down the mechanics of how that works and how to best use the mechanics of getting the copper ingots from drowned farms, but even using fortune on the naturally generating veins of copper is a pretty nice option as well. Now, we didn't really talk about calcite while we were down next to the geode, but calcite is the intermediary block between the outer layer of smooth basalt and the actual amethyst within that you can find. Despite being relatively difficult to get a hold of, I do feel like calcite is something that is worth at least farming up, because it is a really nice textured block. It has a better texture than diorite for sure. The one drawback is it does not currently have any variants, meaning you can't turn it into stairs, slabs, other things of that nature, which I personally would like to see, and maybe we will see that with 1.18 and further updates to this block. But even just as a base building block, it's much better than its predecessor being diorite, so I would recommend that. Again, it's going to be grindy to get because you have to seek out the amethyst geodes, and that's not exactly the easiest thing to do because they are fairly rare, and unless they're exposed to them, you're only going to run into them by chance when strip mining. So worth it, yes, especially if you're looking for those building blocks in a survival type land, but just understand that it is going to be kind of a stressful undertaking. Next on the docket, we have candles, and I think candles are a really awesome addition to the game because it's a new and exciting light block, and there's just a lot that you can do with the candles, and it's fairly easy to farm up, especially if you are familiar with building a drown farm or with building a honey farm with bees, because as long as you have honeycomb and decent access to string, you can make infinite amount of candles, and you can dye them many different colors, combining them with the many different dyes that are available throughout the game. So candles, very much worth farming up. You may just have to become a little bit more familiar in setting up a bee farm if you want to do this a bit more consistently. But it is doable, and there's plenty of designs out there that are highly efficient. Next up, we have the glowberries and the cave vines. So when it comes to the vines that are formed when placing glowberries on top of each other, these are really nice ambient spaces, so I think that these are fairly useful. Now, when it comes to finding glowberries, you're going to have to raid some chests from mine shafts in order to get these. Currently, they will be easier to get in 1.18 when they generate naturally, so at least we have that to look forward to. In terms of a food source, they're not great, and I have made a video talking about how you can kind of automate this process if you are wanting large amounts of it. I will leave a link to that video in the description if you want to go ahead and check that out, as the farm is relatively easy to set up and doesn't require any super technical redstone to do so and automate as well. It requires hunting down some foxes, but that's decently easy to do if you know how they work and how you can best manipulate them. So worth farming, one of the more tedious things to do, to be sure. Next up, we have the deep slate and all of the deep slate variants. I think that deep slate is a really cool block, and I do feel kind of bad because it kind of undercut the new dark textured block available in the game with the addition of Blackstone that came with the 1.16 Nether update. But there's a lot to love about deep slate, and it actually can complement Blackstone fairly nicely. It's very easy to get. You just need to go down low into your world. The one drawback I think that the one complaint that I really have with deep slate is you do have to farm it manually. There's not a way to set up any sort of automatic generation. So maybe if we saw something like that added in, it'd be cool. But again, it's going to be very, very easy to come across, especially in 1.18 with the extended world depth and deep slate spawning almost exclusively down below Y level 0. So for now, I think it's fine, and it will get easier to acquire as the updates continue. So the next item of business is the drip leaf, and the small drip leaf plant is the only way to get drip leaf currently. You're going to need to find some small drip leaf, and I don't know why I can't place this. Maybe it can only be placed on clay, and that does appear to be the case. So you can only place this on clay in order to be able to farm up the big drip leaf. Now, the drawback with the small drip leaf plant is the current only way to get this plant is through the Wandering Trader. Again, it will be a lot easier to obtain in later on versions of the game, but as soon as you have one of these, you can get infinite amounts of the big drip leaf, because you will be able to bone meal the small drip leaf into big drip leaf plants, and then for every amount of bone meal you add to a large drip leaf, you will get the larger plant, and for every section that you break, or for every section that you grow it up, you will be able to get a brand new section of that plant. So in terms of the small drip leaf, probably not worth farming in excess, especially with as difficult as it can be, and it's a random drop off of the Wandering Trader. But when it comes to the large drip leaf, especially if you want to do parkour type obstacle courses, I do feel like that's something that is quite useful to farm up. Both blocks add a decent amount of aesthetics to the game. So if you're really wanting to kind of spice up some of the natural feel of your build and your base, then of course these can be farmed up for those purposes as well. The big drip leaf more so than the small drip leaf, because again, the small drip leaf is only available in limited quantities. Next up, we have the two different versions of dripstone. Of course, there's the dripstone block, and then there is the pointed dripstone. And these are actually both decently easy to farm up. You can create the blocks out of the pointed dripstone by making farms, and all you have to do in order to farm the dripstone is put a water source block above. It doesn't have to be a deep dripstone block, but putting a water source block above here, and then over time it will continue to drip down and elongate both the stalactite hanging off the top as well as the stalagmite at the bottom where the water will drip. You may not even need a water source block above now that I'm seeing that there is dripping occurring from that. It will take quite some time to build this up, but it is farmable and it does have its uses. The dripstone block, of course, is a semi-decent building block, and the pointed dripstone can be used for a lot of different projects and traps. So certainly worth investigating and one of the easier things to farm up. I know that CubFan has a really good video talking about how to farm up pointed dripstone in a bunch of different ways, both automated and otherwise. So I would recommend doing this one as well. Next, we have the glow lichen, and the glow lichen, it's interesting. It's easy enough to farm up once you have access to a decent amount of bone meal. It adds some decent texture to walls, ceilings, floors, that type of stuff, though it will not spawn proof anything. So it might be worth farming. It might be worth adding some of that additional texture variation, but all things considered, it's one of the more niche items, so you won't be missing out a whole lot if you decide to not farm up the glow lichen, and you will need to have access to a lot of shears if you want to be able to do this. I don't recall if the glow lichen can be obtained with silk touch, but I don't believe that it can. So certainly something to keep in mind with the glow lichen. It can kind of spruce up and give a little bit more personality to some of your builds, but apart from that, it doesn't have a whole lot of a purpose, and currently doesn't prevent spawns, though if they continue to use the proposed changes to 1.18 that we saw last week, then later on down the road it certainly will be more useful to a certain extent. So we didn't really discuss this item when talking about the azalea tree, but you can get hanging roots from rooted dirt that spawns underneath an azalea tree whenever you grow up one of those smaller bushes. I don't particularly think that these are all that great, though it is easy to farm up once you have one block of rooted dirt. So if you're wanting to add a little bit more personality and texturing to your builds, again, it's an option. It's something that you can use and consider. But apart from that, it's not my favorite, though it is relatively easy to farm should you choose to do so. Now, the moss block is a block that I highly recommend. For a lot of different reasons. One, it's got an incredible texture to it. It's very easy to farm. Etho has a phenomenal video about how you can set up an automatic moss farm, and it's actually really has a really good rate of return on converting over into bone meal as well. So you can collect it as a building and texturing block, or you can even use it as one of the more efficient bone meal farms that's currently available. You can also get those azalea bushes from this. You can get moss carpet. You can get a lot of really nice stuff from the moss blocks. So this one is certainly worth taking some time to farm up if you care to use the awesome features that were added with the moss block. Now, powdered snow is another one that's kind of interesting, mainly because in 1.17 it is a little bit harder to farm, and it was made slightly easier with an increased rate of collection out of cauldrons, because you have to have cauldrons set up in a high altitude where it starts to snow whenever there's overworld rain, and then you have to be in that area and wait for it to fill up. So at least currently, it will generate naturally as a part of 1.18, where it'll be considerably easier to farm. I don't know that this is worth farming in large quantities, but it is certainly handy to have a couple of these buckets on hand, especially if you want to make a stray converter from a skeleton spawner. And I've made a video on that. You've probably already seen it. On the off chance that you haven't, I'll go ahead and place a link to that video in the description as well. That goes more into depth about how the powdered snow block works and how you can use it to create a stray farm out of a skeleton spawner. We briefly mentioned smooth basalt when we talked about the geodes, and smooth basalt is a really nice additional texture to the basalt family, where previously we just had basalt and then the polished basalt. And the basalt is, or the smooth basalt is really easy to get because we already have the basalt generators that have been set up, and once you have a basalt generator, all you need to do is run this through a furnace. You don't even need to strip it off of a geode because you can create it on your own. So I would personally recommend getting this one because I actually prefer the texture of the smooth basalt even to just the basic basalt. And it's very easy to get your hands on as well. Tinted glass is a really fun block that again plays into the amethyst and collecting up the amethyst shards and combining that with glass, because it will allow you to completely negate the passage of light, and that's very ideal for mob farms, especially again if they continue to keep up with the lighting changes that are proposed for 1.18. This will be almost essential for making functional mob spawners because it will block out any source of light getting into that area. And in terms of how easy it is to get, it's not terribly easy, but again, if you are taking advantage of the suggestion of using a fortune to collect up the amethyst shards, then you'll find it a lot easier when it comes to actually making and crafting this tinted glass. And the last block that we need to talk about is the tuff. And tuff is, again, something that you can just find naturally generating down low in the world. And it has a decent texture to it. I actually feel that it goes along rather well with the gravel texture for some variation in your roads. So I actually think that tuff is something that's worth grinding out. Again, you just kind of have to go out and manually harvest it, but it's not the worst thing in the world to track down, and it kind of puts it along the same lines as deep slate. So of course we have one of the new mobs here in the form of the axolotl. I do think that axolotls are a lot of fun, and apart from breeding them with tropical fish or buckets of tropical fish, you will need to kind of hunt these guys down in their underworld cave generation. They will only spawn in underwater caves, and that's the same for the glow squids. But I don't know that these guys are worth farming in forms of natural generation. But once you have a couple of them and you can find some tropical fish, they will be significantly easier to farm up. So that is at least worth some consideration with the axolotl. For nothing else, the collector's item of getting the blue variant, or the rare blue variant of the axolotl, that was now made a breeding exclusive with the update to 1.17.1. So a lot of fun things to be had here. A novelty, if nothing else, but still a lot of really cool applications added with the axolotl's inclusion. Speaking of mobs that spawn in caves and in darkness, we do have the glow squid and the options that you have with collecting both the glow ink as well as being able to craft the glow item frame and apply that to signs as well. These I actually feel are a little bit underrated, specifically in the realm of the signs, because it allows you to be able to see very clearly what you've placed, even in the darkest of circumstances. So I personally think that the glow ink is very worth farming, is very much worth farming, especially with the updates that you can do to signs and then crafting these glow ink frames. It can be a little bit tedious, but there are farm concepts that you can set up to kind of get these things to spawn in increased numbers and better, more efficiently farm the glow ink out of it. So I do feel like this one is worth it, especially with a lot of the cool things that you can do with causing the signs to glow. There's a lot of really awesome texturing that you can add to interior decoration on your builds. Going back to the amethyst shards for a moment, there is the subject of the spyglass. And I think that the spyglass is kind of cool with what it offers in concept, but I mean, what it really comes down to is this is a good alternative for Optifine. If you don't have that, and if you didn't know, you can disable the reticle that shows up, or the overlay of the spyglass, by entering F1 mode. And I think that that's a win, and hope that that doesn't get patched, because again, this just kind of serves as being an option or a replacement for Optifine that exists within the base game. It is a little bit upsetting that you have to craft the item and with a resource that can be kind of difficult to get your hands on. But it is still a really cool addition. And in terms of farming, I mean, once you have one, you really don't need another one. But if you don't have Optifine or can't use Optifine, then this, of course, is a good alternative option for you. Now, we've talked about axolotls and glow squid, which have their own reasons for being farmed. The last item, or the last thing that we really have to talk about in terms of new additions, is goats and being able to farm these goats. I know that in 1.18 these things are bound to be a lot better than what they already are. Currently they're just kind of a nuisance and ramming into the player and entities at random. But perhaps there will be a purpose in farming up goats and breeding goats later on down the road. For now, I don't really know that it's worth a lot of your time. So stay tuned for 1.18 and the additional applications that the goats are bound to have. For now, for the novelty, it's fine, but I don't recommend going out of your way to breed up goats in mass amounts. But that is going to do it for my opinions on what items or blocks in the new update are worth your time in terms to setting up farms, or what the best way of going about it might be. If you have any thoughts or additions, be sure to let me know what those are in the comments down below. And don't forget to subscribe for the daily variety content. Thanks again for your time, and I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day. Bye-bye.